Imagine standing on a battlefield where two armies face each other across a wide valley. The tension in the air is heavy. Soldiers grip their weapons, shields raised, waiting for the moment when the fighting might begin. But the battle never starts. Instead, every morning something terrifying happens. From the camp of the Philistines, a massive warrior walks forward into the open field. His armor glitters in the sunlight. The ground seems to shake with every step he takes. His name is Goliath. He is not just another soldier. According to the Bible, Goliath stood nearly 9 feet tall. He wore heavy bronze armor, carried a spear like a weaver's beam, and moved with the confidence of a warrior who had never been defeated. And every day he shouted the same challenge across the valley. "Choose a man and let him come down to fight me." If the Israelite soldier defeated Goliath, the Philistines would surrender. But if Goliath won, Israel would become their servants. It sounded simple, yet day after day, no one stepped forward. Not the strongest warrior in Israel, not the most experienced soldiers, not even King Saul, the leader of the army. For 40 days, the giant repeated his challenge, and for 40 days, the entire army of Israel stood frozen with fear. But then, something unexpected happened. One day, a young boy arrived at the battlefield. He wasn't a soldier, he didn't wear armor, he didn't carry a sword. He was just a shepherd named David, sent by his father to bring food to his older brothers who were serving in the army. At first, he was simply an observer, but when David heard the giant's challenge, something inside him stirred. While the soldiers trembled, David saw the situation very differently. No armor, no military training, just courage and faith. And soon this young shepherd would do something no warrior in Israel dared to attempt. But this raises a powerful question. Out of an entire army of trained soldiers, why was David the one who defeated Goliath? Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you something. Imagine standing on that battlefield. In front of you is a giant warrior, strong, experienced, and feared by an entire army. Soldiers all around you are afraid to step forward. Now, ask yourself this. Would you have the courage to face him? Would you trust your strength, or would you rely on faith? I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read many of your comments, and your thoughts always make these stories even more meaningful. And if you enjoy powerful Bible stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the Scriptures.
Long before he ever stepped onto a battlefield, David lived a very different life. Far from the noise of war, far from the politics of kings and armies, David spent most of his days in quiet fields and rocky hillsides. He was the youngest son of a man named Jesse, who lived in the small town of Bethlehem. In a family with many older brothers, David was not the warrior everyone expected to lead Israel into battle. His brothers were stronger, older, and trained for the kind of life that involved conflict and responsibility. David, however, had a different role. He was a shepherd. Every morning, David would take his father's flock out into the fields. The job might sound simple, but being a shepherd required patience, courage, and constant attention. Sheep are vulnerable animals. They can easily wander into danger or become prey for wild predators. David's responsibility was to guide them to good pasture, protect them from harm, and make sure none of them were lost. This meant long hours spent alone. Imagine David sitting on a hillside, watching over the flock as the wind moved through the grass. The quiet fields gave him time to think, to reflect, and perhaps most importantly, to grow in faith. During those long days, David developed a deep trust in God. He also carried something unusual for a shepherd, a harp. David was known for his musical talent. When the sun began to set and the sheep rested quietly, David would play the harp and sing songs. Many believed that these moments in the fields helped inspire the Psalms that later became part of the Bible. Music was one way David expressed his faith. But being a shepherd also taught him something else: courage. When danger came, David did not run. Later in the story, David tells King Saul that he had fought off wild animals to protect his flock. When a lion or a bear attacked the sheep, David chased the predator away and rescued the animal. Those experiences were not battles fought on a grand stage. There were no crowds watching, no soldiers cheering him on. Just David and the responsibility to protect what had been entrusted to him. These moments shaped his character. They taught him that courage often begins in small, unseen situations. While David was growing stronger in the fields, the soldiers of Israel were training for war. They wore armor, they carried swords and spears, they learned military tactics and discipline. In the eyes of the world, those soldiers looked like the heroes of Israel. David did not. He was simply a young shepherd boy. No armor, no military training, no reputation as a warrior. Yet sometimes the greatest strength is hidden in the most unexpected places. While the soldiers focused on weapons and strategy, David had developed something even more powerful: faith. His confidence did not come from physical strength or years of combat experience. It came from trusting that God was with him. So when David eventually arrived at the battlefield where Goliath was terrifying the army of Israel, he saw the situation very differently from everyone else. Where the soldiers saw an unbeatable giant, David saw something else entirely, something the others had overlooked, something far greater than the size of the enemy standing before them. And because of that, David saw something the others didn't.
When David arrived at the battlefield and heard Goliath's challenge, he reacted very differently from everyone else. The soldiers of Israel saw a giant. David saw something else. To understand why David was different, we have to go back to the life he lived before that moment, before the battlefield, before the giant, before the world even knew his name. David was just a shepherd, and the life of a shepherd was not easy. Every day he led his father's sheep across open hills and rocky valleys, searching for grass and water. But the peaceful image of a shepherd with a flock often hides the dangers that come with the job. Wild animals were always a threat. Lions roamed the wilderness, bears could attack without warning. A single predator could scatter the entire flock within seconds. And when that happened, the shepherd had to act quickly. David later explained this to King Saul. He said that when a lion or a bear attacked the flock and carried off one of the sheep, he did not run away, he chased it. Imagine that for a moment. A young shepherd boy running toward a wild lion instead of away from it. David would strike the animal and rescue the sheep from its mouth, and if the predator turned on him, David fought it directly. These were not easy victories. A lion is one of the most powerful predators in the wild. A bear is even more terrifying. Yet David faced them alone. No army, no armor, just a shepherd's staff, a sling, and courage. But the most important thing David carried with him was not a weapon. It was faith. David believed that God was with him in those moments. When danger appeared in the fields, David trusted that he was not fighting alone. This belief shaped the way he saw the world. While others relied only on their own strength, David relied on God. That is why the battlefield looked different through David's eyes. The soldiers of Israel looked at Goliath and saw a warrior who was too strong to defeat. His armor was massive, his spear was enormous, his voice echoed across the valley as he mocked the army of Israel. Fear spread through the camp.
But David remembered something important. If God had helped him face a lion, if God had helped him defeat a bear, then the same God could help him face this giant. David did not measure the battle by the size of his enemy. He measured it by the strength of his faith. To the soldiers, Goliath looked unstoppable. To David, Goliath was simply another challenge. This difference in perspective is what made David unique. The soldiers were trained warriors, but fear controlled their decisions. David was only a shepherd, but faith guided his actions. Fear asks the question, "What if I fail?" Faith asks a different question, "What if God is with me?" And that question changed everything. David looked at the giant who had terrified an entire army for 40 days, and instead of seeing an impossible enemy, he saw someone who was defying the living God. That stirred something inside him. He could not stand quietly while the giant mocked his people and his faith. In that moment, David made a decision that would shock the entire army, a decision that would change his life forever. The shepherd boy stepped forward, and soon, David would volunteer to face the giant.
When David stepped forward and declared that he was willing to fight the giant, the news quickly spread through the camp of Israel. At first, the soldiers probably thought it was a joke. A shepherd boy? The same giant who had terrified trained warriors for 40 days, and now a young boy wanted to face him? But David was serious. Soon, word of David's bold offer reached King Saul, the leader of Israel's army. Saul was the tallest man in Israel and a seasoned warrior himself, yet even he had been unable to find someone brave enough to face Goliath. Curious and perhaps desperate, Saul ordered that the young shepherd be brought before him. Imagine the scene. Inside the king's tent stood experienced soldiers, battle-hardened men who had seen war before. Into that room walked David, a young shepherd boy who had spent most of his life caring for sheep. Saul looked at him and immediately saw the obvious problem. David was young. Goliath was a giant. And the king said exactly what everyone else was thinking. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." From Saul's perspective, this was simple logic. Goliath had spent his entire life training for battle. David had never fought in a war. But David did not back down. Instead, he calmly explained something that changed the conversation. David told the king about his life as a shepherd. He described how he had protected his father's flock from lions and bears. When a predator attacked and carried off a sheep, David chased it down and rescued the animal. And if the animal turned on him, David fought it. Then he said something remarkable. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." In other words, David was not relying on his own strength. He was trusting God. Saul listened carefully. Perhaps the king saw something unusual in the young shepherd's confidence. Perhaps he realized that no one else in the army had the courage David was showing. Eventually, Saul made a decision. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." But before David left, Saul wanted to help him prepare. The king ordered his own armor to be brought forward. This was no ordinary armor. Saul's equipment represented the best protection Israel had to offer. Soldiers carefully placed the heavy bronze helmet on David's head. They fitted the armor around his body and fastened the sword at his side. For a moment, David stood there dressed like a warrior. But something felt wrong. The armor was heavy. The sword was unfamiliar. David had never fought wearing equipment like this before. He tried to walk. It was awkward, slow, restricting. Finally, David stopped. He turned to Saul and said something simple but honest. "I cannot go in these." The armor that symbolized strength for a soldier was actually a burden for David. So David made a surprising decision. He removed the helmet. He set aside the heavy armor.
he took off the sword. The entire army expected a warrior to face the giant, but David was about to fight in a completely different way, because instead of relying on the weapons of soldiers, David removed the armor. After removing the heavy armor, David prepared himself in a very different way. Instead of a sword, he carried something far simpler, a sling. To modern readers, a sling might seem like a small and insignificant weapon, but in ancient times, skilled shepherds could use a sling with incredible accuracy and power. A stone launched from a sling could travel faster than many arrows and strike with tremendous force. For David, the sling was not unfamiliar. He had used it many times before while protecting his father's flock. But before stepping onto the battlefield, David did something important. He walked down to a nearby stream. There, he knelt beside the water and carefully selected 5 smooth stones from the riverbed. Each stone was shaped by the flow of water over time, rounded and balanced, perfect for the sling. One by one, he placed the stones into his shepherd's pouch. No armor, no sword, just a sling and 5 stones. Then David stood up and began walking toward the battlefield. Across the valley, the massive figure of Goliath was already waiting. The giant stepped forward again, his armor gleaming in the sunlight. His shield-bearer walked ahead of him, carrying the enormous shield that protected the warrior. When Goliath saw David approaching, he stopped. For a moment, the giant seemed confused. This was not the warrior he expected. Standing before him was a young shepherd boy, dressed not in armor, but in simple clothing, holding a staff and carrying a sling. Then Goliath began to laugh. The giant mocked David openly. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" His voice echoed across the valley as he cursed David and the God of Israel. To Goliath, the situation was insulting. After 40 days of challenging Israel's army, this was the opponent they finally sent? A shepherd boy? But David did not retreat. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke words that would echo through history. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David declared, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David's confidence did not come from his weapon, it came from his faith. He continued, declaring that the battle would show everyone something important, that victory does not come from swords or spears, but from God. By now, the giant had heard enough. Angry and insulted, the giant began moving toward David, ready to crush the young challenger. But David did something unexpected. Instead of backing away, he ran toward the giant. As he ran, he reached into his shepherd's pouch and pulled out one of the smooth stones. Quickly placing it into his sling, David began to swing the weapon in a fast circular motion. The tension in the valley must have been overwhelming. An entire army watched in silence. A giant warrior advanced with massive weapons. A shepherd boy ran forward with nothing but a sling and a stone. And in the next few seconds, everything would change. David released the sling. The stone flew through the air with incredible speed, and in that moment, the battle began.
The stone flew through the air with incredible speed. In that brief moment, time must have seemed to slow down for everyone watching. On one side stood Goliath, the giant warrior who had terrified an entire army for 40 days. His armor gleamed under the sun, his massive spear still clutched in his hand as he moved forward to crush the young challenger. On the other side was David, a shepherd boy, running across the battlefield with nothing but a sling and faith. The soldiers of Israel watched in stunned silence. The Philistine army watched with confidence, certain that their champion would destroy the boy within seconds. But something unexpected was about to happen.
David released the sling. The stone shot forward like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the air with deadly accuracy. Years of practice protecting his father's sheep had given David incredible skill with this simple weapon. This was not luck, this was precision. The stone struck Goliath directly in the forehead, the one place not fully protected by his armor. The impact was powerful. The giant stopped. For a brief moment, the enormous warrior stood frozen in place. Then the unthinkable happened. Goliath fell. The massive champion of the Philistines collapsed forward onto the ground with a thunderous crash. The warrior who had mocked Israel's army, who had stood undefeated and fearless for weeks, now lay motionless in the dust. The valley went silent. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. The giant was defeated. David had not used a sword. He had not worn armor. He had not fought with the strength of a trained soldier. Instead, he had trusted in something far greater. Faith had overcome fear. The shepherd boy quickly ran forward toward the fallen giant. Since David had no sword of his own, he took Goliath's massive weapon and used it to finish the victory. At that moment, the Philistine army realized what had happened. Their champion, the warrior they believed could never lose, was gone. Panic spread through their ranks. The same soldiers who had stood confidently behind Goliath now turned and fled across the battlefield. Seeing their enemy retreat, the army of Israel suddenly found its courage. With a shout, the soldiers of Israel charged forward. What had begun as a terrifying standoff had now become a decisive victory. The valley that had been filled with fear for 40 days was suddenly filled with triumph. But the most remarkable part of the story was not the battle itself. It was who had won it. Not a king, not a seasoned warrior, a shepherd boy, a young man who believed that the strength of God was greater than the strength of any giant. The moment David's stone struck Goliath did more than win a battle. It changed the course of history, because that single moment proved something powerful to everyone watching. Victory does not always belong to the strongest. Sometimes it belongs to the one who has the courage to believe. And as the giant lay defeated on the battlefield, one truth became clear to the entire world. The impossible had happened. After the battle ended and the giant lay defeated on the ground, one question remained. How did David win? From a human perspective, the outcome seemed impossible. Goliath was a trained warrior, covered in armor, armed with powerful weapons, and feared by an entire army. David was none of those things. He was young, he had no armor, he carried only a sling and a few stones. Yet David walked away victorious. The reason for that victory can be understood through three powerful qualities that shaped David's life: faith, courage, and trust in God. First, there was faith. David believed that God was greater than any giant standing before him. While the soldiers focused on Goliath's size and strength, David focused on something else: the power of the God he served. That faith gave him confidence when everyone else felt fear. Second, there was courage. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. It means choosing to move forward despite it. The entire army of Israel had seen the same giant that David saw. But while others allowed fear to stop them, David stepped forward. He did not wait for someone else to act. He chose to face the challenge himself. Finally, there was trust in God. David did not believe that victory would come from his own skill alone. Even though he was skilled with a sling, David understood that the real source of strength came from God. Before the battle began, he made this clear when he said that the fight belonged to the Lord. In other words, David placed the outcome in God's hands. Faith gave him confidence, courage gave him the strength to step forward, and trust in God gave him peace even in the middle of danger. These qualities are what truly separated David from everyone else on the battlefield. While others measured the battle by the size of the giant, David measured it by the greatness of God. After the battle with Goliath, David's life changed forever. The young shepherd who had once spent his days quietly watching over sheep was suddenly known throughout the entire land of Israel. News of the victory spread quickly. People told the story of the boy who defeated the giant, and David became a symbol of courage and faith. Wherever the army of Israel traveled, people began to recognize his name. David did not win the battle with great weapons or powerful armor. He won it with faith and trust in God, and that victory made a deep impression on the people of Israel. In time, David continued to serve the nation. He fought in many battles and proved himself to be a wise and brave leader. The people respected him, and his reputation continued to grow. Years later, David would rise to an even greater role. The shepherd boy who once stood alone against a giant would eventually become the king of Israel. Under his leadership, Israel experienced a time of strength and unity. David became one of the most important kings in the history of the Bible. But long before the crown, long before the throne, David was simply a shepherd who trusted God. The story of David and Goliath has been told for thousands of years, and yet it still speaks powerfully to people today. At first glance, it may seem like a simple story about a young boy defeating a giant, but when we look deeper, we discover that the real message of the story is much greater. It is a story about faith, courage, and trust in God. When the army of Israel saw Goliath, they saw a giant who was too strong to defeat. His armor, his weapons, and his size made him look unstoppable. Fear spread through the entire camp, and no one dared to face him. But David looked at the same giant and saw something different. He did not measure the problem by the size of the enemy. Instead, he measured it by the power of the God he believed in. That faith gave him courage, and that courage allowed him to step forward when everyone else stepped back. David reminds us that strength does not always come from power, experience, or appearance. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from believing that you are not facing your battles alone. Because when faith replaces fear, even the biggest challenges can be overcome. This is why the story of David continues to inspire people around the world. It reminds us that sometimes the person who changes everything is not the strongest warrior in the army. Sometimes it is the one who trusts God the most. Because in many moments of history, one truth continues to prove itself again and again. Sometimes the biggest victories come from the smallest warriors. And now I want to ask you something. If you were David, would you have had the courage to face the giant? If you enjoyed this story about David and Goliath, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from the Bible. Every week we explore incredible moments from Scripture, stories of faith, courage, and the people who changed history. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were David, would you have faced Goliath? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this story, you might like our next video about why God chose Noah to save the world. Don't miss it.
You are the young man who slew the giant. Speak, what is your name, and whose son are you?
Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.
You are not able to go against him, for you are just a youth.
When the lion and the bear came against me, I struck them down and rescued the flock. The Lord delivered me from their paws.